New season of entertainment on BBC One.
This is BBC One for the Midlands. Now the last in this series of Day Out finds St John Howell in the Shropshire town of Ludlow.
Ludlow is a small, rather sleepy market town nestling in the heart of the Shropshire countryside. There's been a settlement of some kind here for 900 years, and under the protection of its medieval castle, Ludlow was for centuries the most important outpost between England and the marauding Welsh. The Council of the Marches, the political body which ran the whole western area, was based here. But more than any other town in England, Ludlow's colourful history is written across the face of its buildings, which have survived in excellent condition through almost every stage of the town's development. Few stretches remain of the wall which once completely enclosed the town, and 6 of the 7 gates have gone, but one survives at the bottom of Broad Street. What better way to enter Ludlow, as countless thousands have before me, than through the original Broad Gate? It stood here strong and proud, guarding the southern entrance to the town since the early part of the 13th century. And it was from that slit up there that the archers defending the gate released their arrows against the invader. But these days you do rather take your life in your hands, because you have to inch your way through along with cars, vans and motorcycles. It is a squeeze, as you can see. In fact, it's rather surprising that some local wag hasn't perhaps christened it either Narrow Gate or possibly Squeeze Gate. Anyway, once through the arch, here we come to the bottom end of Broad Street with its beautiful, famous rows of Georgian houses, mellowed brickwork and gleaming brass knockers. This is looked on as one of England's finest streets, with its architectural balance of Tudor, Georgian and Victorian. Thomas Telford, the famous engineer, left his mark here. In 1829 he levelled out the gradient of the street, and it's been known ever since as Telford's Trench. At the top of Broad Street and in the centre of the town is the Buttercross. In its time, it's been both a market and a school. Ludlow is crammed with narrow streets and little alleyways, and in one of them, just behind the Buttercross, you come across the equally tiny Ludlow Museum. Morning.
Morning.
How much?
35 pence, please.
35.
Thank you.
Count. The museum goes back a long time, as I discovered from its curator, John Norton.
Well, the idea is supposed to have come from Lucien Bonaparte when he was prisoner of war in Ludlow in 1811. That's really a local tradition, and people think he started a museum in the stables, but the museum officially started in 1833 when the Ludlow Natural History Society was formed. So it must be one of the older museums in the country.
It's very charming, but very cramped.
Well, we're terribly short of space. We've just got a very small display area, and it's so small that we can only do one theme in here, and that's the story of Ludlow and how it grew up as a planned town.
Looking round, it's very noticeable just how many things have come from the castle itself.
Yes, things are still being found. Actually, these carved ivories were found in the 1960s when they were doing some restoration work at Mortimer's Tower at the castle, and they believed to be about the middle of the 16th century. the detail on that face is so remarkable that we think it really must represent some real person.
And was that found by workmen?
That was found by workmen when they were doing some repairs and restoration to the tower.
And what about the silver jug?
Well, it's pewter, actually. This is from the castle, and it's believed to have been found in the deep well. This has got the arms of Charles I on here, but the whole character of the jug would suggest something earlier. It's really a pre-Reformation style.
And what are these vicious-looking instruments we have behind it?
Oh, this is a terrible thing. This is another thing that was found in the well at the castle. This is believed to date from about 1630 or 1640, and it's an instrument of torture. These screws here tighten up and it would compress the skull, and then they put a hot iron and branded the cheek of the poor victim through here, and I suppose they would always know him again after that.
Wherever you turn in Ludlow, the buildings, courtyards and alleyways have literally 500 years of history written right across them. What is now Quality Square was once the garden of the home of Charles Fox, Secretary to the Council of the Marches. This is the original 16th century brickwork of Charles Fox's house. Now, notice how narrow the bricks are. That was a feature of the period. But bits have been added on ever since. Over here we have an 18th century restoration. And down here, some 19th century stables, which these days house a small bakery. This part of the building was restored in the 17th century, and bringing us right up to date, a small antique shop which has been restored within the last 12 months. The castle has dominated Ludlow throughout its history, and it's still very much the focal point for tourists. It must have been very well fortified to have survived in such good condition. And was this perhaps part of the original armament? Sebastopol, 1855. Oh, well, perhaps not. Ludlow Castle has in its time been home to kings, queens and princes, and it features in the pages of Shakespeare, Marlowe and Milton. Since the 12th century, it's provided a wealth of detail for historians like Martin Spate.
The de Lacy family had been given estates on the Welsh border by the Conqueror, and when the Norman lords were given these estates, there was an obligation to defend the border against the Welsh. And Ludlow, with the precipitous cliffs on which the castle stood, the river surrounding it, was a natural defensive site, which made it one of the best strategic positions in the central marches. Because the castle needed servicing, a town grew up around it, and this is something which we think underlay what is now the Outer Bailey and parts of the town beyond. About 1150, the whole town was redesigned and a new town laid out as something of a business venture. New towns one finds right down the Welsh marches, and indeed in other parts of this country and France. And where a town was successful, it was a very good business investment for its lord.
But the townspeople also got protection.
Oh yes, they enjoyed privileges which country people didn't. There's the old saying of town air made free, and when you'd been a townsperson for a year, this gave you certain rights and privileges which your rural neighbours didn't enjoy.
Nowadays, as we look around, how much of Ludlow Castle is left?
Of the original Norman castle, the keep and quite a substantial amount of the Inner Bailey You can see the square wall towers with the backless towers, which are the early Norman work. The keep itself, which is again unusual because like Richmond and Exeter, it started life as a gatehouse and was subsequently converted into a keep. And then the castle was extended about 1150 to the very large outer bailey. And subsequently, you have a lot of 14th century rebuilding, which has given Ludlow Castle some of the best domestic buildings which can be found in any castle in this country.
At the other end of Castle Square stands a building about which local historians aren't quite so enthusiastic. It's the Town Hall, completed in 1887 and now known to architectural enthusiasts as Ludlow's bad luck. Traditionally, the industries which made Ludlow prosperous were corn milling, paper making, and the manufacture of wool and leather garments. And these relied very heavily on water power provided by the rivers Corve and Team. This is a Team behind me. And from leather grew the very skilled trade of glove making, which in the late 18th century employed over 1,000 people in the town. So you see, over the years, water's played a very important part in Ludlow's history and commercial development. But of course, there again, nobody said you had to drink it. Cheers. For the visitor, there are some delightful walks along the river, but the young people who live here claim there's very little in Ludlow for them. The only obvious facility is the swimming pool, probably the only building in Ludlow with no historical significance whatsoever. Built to a Scandinavian design of the 1930s, the burghers of the time decided one such edifice was enough. Further up the hill, Dinham House, once home to the Earl of Powys, is now a craft centre, while opposite lies the tiny 12th century chapel of St Thomas. But ecclesiastical pride of place must go to the parish church of St Lawrence, which has stood in the centre of the town since the early 15th century. Its soaring perpendicular architecture and the variety of magnificent stained glass give an impression of spaciousness and light. There are books and pamphlets on every aspect of Ludlow's history. There's even one about the history of the organ. Its principal author, Peter Klein, is often found showing visitors around the church.
These carvings are late 19th century. The originals, alas, were stripped out at the time of the Reformation, probably in the 1540s, late 1540s. Basically, though, the basic framework of the choir stalls is original, but the figures and the canopies themselves are based on copies. they are copies of similar types in other churches.
Did any of the carvings survive?
Very, very few. The work of the reformers was pretty thorough. But over here on the opposite side of the stalls, we have two small carvings which have survived in the poppy heads of the bench ends. And in one of them is a figure of a bishop with a triple crown. We believe this is in fact a picture of the Pope, which is really a very unusual thing to find in an English church, especially after the Reformation. The other carving perhaps is the pièce de résistance of the Ludlow carvings, and is a pieta, which shows the Virgin Mary holding the body of Christ after the crucifixion. And it really is a beautiful carving. It's, in such a small carving, it's amazing that so much feeling can be conveyed. There is only one other known in a Shropshire church, and that's at Tong. They are very, very scarce.
We're sitting, Peter, rather uncomfortably on what are known as Misericords.
That's right.
How did they get this name?
Well, the Misericord really is the shelf here on the underside of the seat. What happened was that the priests at the time used to spend many hours singing long services, chanting, and the older members naturally used to sag a bit. And what one could do was to just sag very gently onto this little ledge. So you looked as if you were still standing, but in fact you'd taken the weight off your feet. The main interest in them, though, is that underneath this little shelf you find these marvellous carvings. More often than not, they are medieval moral tales. In the case of Ludlow, they are both these and also the badges of important people who were involved with the construction of the church. In this Misericord, for instance, we see the figure of a harpy, the dissembling woman. Side by side here, her attendants are the bats of hell, the two bats of hell. And this Misericord over here is especially amusing to us today, but one must remember that moral tales like this, to mid-15th century man, it was a very serious matter indeed. Here we see the dishonest alewife. Here she is being carried over the shoulder of a devil, and here she is clasping her pot in which she gave short measure for her beer. On the extreme left, the devil here reads the long, long list of her sins through her life. Another devil plays a bagpipe and pipes her into the gaping maw of hell here on this side. As I say today, a quaint, amusing thing, but a very serious matter for medieval man.
Surrounded on three sides by buildings, the best view of St. Lawrence's is from the immaculately kept churchyard on the north side. A committee of local residents keep the lawns and borders trim, and I found a gentleman called Warren Mead clipping around a cherry tree. Excuse me, I'm fascinated by this notice, the Sommei Yoshino cherry tree, April 1976.
Everyone is. It's funny. This cherry tree was dedicated to A.E. Housman, the poet. And it so happens that he wrote a famous poem in his Shropshire Lad called The Cherry Tree. And so the Housman Society of Japan, that's why the Japanese characters, knowing of this, sent a memorial cherry tree to him here, because this is where he is buried. Just around on the north side of the church are his ashes.
Now, what's an American doing clipping around a Japanese cherry tree in an English churchyard?
I haven't had the question put quite that way, but I'm just retired here, that's all. When I finished work at home, I decided, well, we decided, my wife and I, we wanted to get away from not play bingo with our ancient friends. So we sold everything we had and up stakes and rented a house in Ludlow. We'd never been in Ludlow before, but a friend of a friend had a house to rent. We bought that same house less than a year later, and I've been here ever since. Don't even go to London.
Is it an ideal place, do you think, for an American to retire to?
I have found it to be that, yes. Maybe it's because there aren't very many Americans.
Ludlow may have grown up around its castle, but the church came to have a very powerful influence on the medieval town, when spiritual and material affairs were interlinked, and when, for instance, it was the church that cared for the sick. But not so now. Sadly, the cottage hospital is closed. And if you couple that with the fact that there's a cloud hanging over the maternity unit, and that for some strange reason the nearest ambulance is based 8 miles away at Craven Arms, Ludlow certainly doesn't seem to be the sort of place either to be taken ill or knocked down by a bus. You know, I can't help feeling that if the people who provided the original building on this site were still around, things might be very different. When the Palmers Guild was founded in 1250, it dominated the affairs of the town for 250 years, in a way which no present-day council could approach. Although it began as a kind of cooperative society, it rapidly became a spiritual foundation as well, employing as many as 8 priests to pray for the souls of departed members. It owned a great deal of property and provided schools, almshouses, and general welfare throughout the town. Its headquarters were in the Guild Hall in Mill Street, yet its influence spread far beyond Ludlow. The Ludlow Guild grew so influential that eventually its membership covered the whole of southern England. In fact, when the chaps set off on horseback to collect the subscriptions, it often took them 2 whole years to gather them in. At first sight, some of the buildings around the Guildhall in Mill Street seem to be 18th century, but closer inspection reveals a lack of symmetry to the doors and windows, a sure sign of Georgian frills grafted on to much earlier structures. Surprisingly, one of the minor landmarks of the town is a cafe. It's the epitome of the English tea shop, and it's where the ladies of the town, in their spare moments, come to dine on cucumber sandwiches and pots of broken orange pekoe to graze. I remember when, sometimes as a small boy, I was brought here as a special treat. And in those days, the windows were full of diamond-shaped ice cakes. And a marvelous, distinguished man with a shock of silver hair and a stiff white collar seemed to spend his entire life positioning and rearranging these in the window with a pair of silver-plated tongs. And when 1 cake had been sold, 2 cakes and 3 cakes had been sold, then the whole window had to be rearranged yet again. In fact, he treated them with so much pride and reverence, one could almost have believed that they were indeed the crown jewels. Anyway, that's a memory not lost, but long past, and I don't think I'll be going in today, even for old time's sake. Certainly not with baked beans on toast at £1.35. Just above De Grey's is a country outfitter's with a highly colourful history, Bodnam's, the corner shop. Its present owner, Muriel Curry, is the 5th generation of her family to run it.
Of course, it had been a draper's business ever since it was first built, which is hundreds of years ago. But it was William Bodnam, who was really a bit of a Victorian whiz kid, who came to Ludlow from a farming family. He didn't like cows and horses, he was frightened of them. So he made the very useful step of marrying the daughter of a bonnet maker who lived down Tower Street and ran a small bonnet shop quite a way down. And he worked his way up till he got the corner block, and then sort of a fair amount of buildings belonged to him. He ran furnishing, removals. He established a mail order business for the farming community, which was way ahead of Wells Fargo, I would say. And he put all his sons in this business. He decided that they would do all the tailoring, everything on the spot, which was going to be quite an empire. Then the First World War came. There'd been quarrels. He tried to put too many of his family in the business. There was the youngest one, who decided he wanted to be a sheep farmer in Australia. And great-grandfather said, "Oh, what's good enough for the rest is good enough for you." So that great-uncle Dick of mine, he was so rude to all the customers that after a week he was given his passage to Australia.
And the town of Ludlow itself, has that kept up with the times, do you think?
Well, insofar as it's remained the same size, we have endeavoured not to just lose our image by spreading everywhere. I think that's been a positive thing. We're still a small, flourishing market town, as we've been ever since the Middle Ages. And we have tried to keep up with the needs of the public. We haven't got enormous hypermarkets, but we have got individual service. We've got businesses which are using modern methods as far as we think they work in a small setting.
A reminder of Ludlow's role as an agricultural market town is the bullring. In the middle of the bullring stands the Tolsey or toll house, which in medieval times housed the court of Pye Powder. You see, very often a dispute would arise in the marketplace. Perhaps someone was short-measured or perhaps short-changed. So the villain would be hauled along here pied poudre, literally with the dust still on their feet. The court would impose instant justice with an instant fine. And if the villain didn't like it, well, just too bad. 100 yards below the Tolsey stands perhaps the most photographed building in Ludlow. It's now the Feathers Hotel, but it was originally a private residence for more than one member of the powerful Council of the Marches. You don't have to go far, however, to find somewhere that's been an inn for a very long time. Simply step across the road. Certainly less conspicuous than the Feathers, but even older, is the Bull, Ludlow's oldest coaching inn. In a way, this was the forerunner of the modern motel, because all around this courtyard were stables. If you were a gentleman, your groom slept downstairs with the horses, while you slept in the comfort of your own room upstairs. Kindling for firewood was, of course, extra. These days the stables have gone, and the only thing that happens here once a year is, of course, the Ludlow Fringe Festival. But, of course, the bar is open 365 days a year. Ludlow is probably the best documented town in England. Its tireless historical research group has seen to that. So perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised to find that there's even a definitive guide to the town's public houses. It's the work of my old friend and colleague, writer and journalist, Harry Baker. I've just been thumbing through this book you've written, Harry, an alphabet of Ludlow pubs. What made you put that together?
Well, my father was very interested. He was the chief clerk to the town clerk in London for many years, very interested in the pubs, factually as well as sampling their products. And he used to tell me that when he was a young man, about the 1900s, there were 55 pubs in Ludlow. And when I was a young reporter, there were 33. And now I'm told there are about 22. And so I always think the kind of pubs 11 times table.
Yes, but in 1900, there was one pub for every 94 people in Ludlow.
Well, yeah, it's a split here, it's 95. But yes, but and of course that would be, the population was about 4,500. So there would be over 50 pubs in that reckoning alone. And the licensing justices they were all very much more local now than they are even now. They'd be members of the council, they'd be all the official jobs, the governor of the grammar school, all, and they formed the opinion that the number of pubs should be reduced. And so you can come across the old licensing session reports and all about licensing being withdrawn. And so they got them down then, and as I said, at the end of the First World War in the 1930s, they got them down by, they'd taken 2/5 off, and they're down to 3/5 of what they were. And would make the figure then about one pub to every 150 people. It was still a fair proportion.
The number of pubs may have dwindled, but Ludlow's appeal has remained constant for the thousands of visitors who flock here every year. The young people who gather daily at the Buttercross may feel that Ludlow's 25 miles from everywhere, but perhaps that's one reason why its charm has survived unspoiled. It remains one of the most beautiful towns in England, and certainly one of the best preserved. It may no longer have the social prominence of Georgian times, nor the political power it enjoyed in earlier years. But Ludlow Castle has presided over nearly 900 years of history and will be around for some time yet.
Beginning next Friday evening is a new series of What a Picture, when Morgan Cross will be leafing through the pages of some more famous photo albums. His guest in the first edition will be the well-known actress Noel Gordon. That's in What a Picture, next Friday evening at 10:15.
The BBC presents live from Earth, the 21st Century Show. From the BBC Television Centre, camera teams are setting out to cover the world. Flown by our very own BBC Concords. Marvel at the wonders of ancient Egypt. Be charmed by South Africa and its exotic tribal dances.